Hello, I'm Eunsong Kim. I'm a faculty in the English department at Northeastern, and I'm so excited to welcome you to the 2024 Brooklyn Book Festival's virtual festival day for a conversation with the wonderful Billy-Ray Belcourt and Bhanu Kapil. So to introduce our wonderful panel, which is titled Surviving Coexistence, we have Billy-Ray Belcourt is from the Driftpile Cree Nation. He's an associate professor in the School of Creative Writing at the University of British Columbia. He's the author of 5 books: This Wound is a World, Indigenous Coping Mechanisms, Notes from the Field, A History of My Brief Body, A Minor Chorus, and Coexistence, which you can buy with the link below. Bhanu Kapil is a British-American poet. She's the author of 6 books of poetry and hybrid works, including 2 new non-identical editions of Incubation, A Space for Monsters, published by Prototype in the UK and Kelsey Street Press in San Francisco in 2023. Currently, she's based in Cambridge, where she's an extraordinary fellow of Churchill College, the winner of the T.S. Eliot Prize, a Wyndham Campbell Prize, and a Chomley Award from the Society of Authors. Kapil has written 2 new books, as yet in manuscript form: The Secret Garden, a novel of the forest, and Promiscuity, an unpublishable work of creative nonfiction, which should be published, I think. So once again, before we begin, I want to let you know that the books by the authors in this program can be purchased in the link below. So in order to set the stage and the tone for the conversation, I wanted to ask the both of you if you could read a small excerpt from your books, Billy-Ray from Coexistence and Bhanu from Incubation. In particular, Billy-Ray, can we hear from the story poetry class on page 44 and 45, and Bhanu from Monster Checklist 2 on page 117?
Cool. Thank you so much. Really happy to be here with you both and to be at the Brooklyn Book Festival, although virtually. I was sweating over what I was going to read, so it was a relief to be told what to read, to be asked to read something. So this is from a short story called Poetry Class that I'll say quickly is about a depressed poetry professor whose relationship is falling apart, and he still has to teach in the midst of it. What constitutes the poetic imagination? I began once the students quieted down. It was our 3rd class. The question was far overdue. A desire for freedom, a critique of the tyranny of materiality, also a love of images, a longing for an image to hold us, maybe in the way that iconic images like God or the afterlife inspire the lives of so many. Is poetry spiritual then? What do we think? My students, all 10 of them, stared at me, some blankly, others quizzically. I had already begun to appreciate their attentiveness immensely, even when it was undergirded by confusion. After a decade or so of teaching, the company of students had become an integral part of my social life. Our conversations about art and literature had shaped who I was as much as my partner or my upbringing had. My students taught me to undermine institutional authority, to be vulnerable even when I felt guarded. I've tried to act as generously and rigorously as possible. I've tried to persuade them to see writing as one method by which to testify to their right to exist in the world. Are you asking if poetry has something to do with the soul? Asked one student. I suppose so, though the soul can mean something non-religious. I don't think there's a fixed relationship between the two, the student continued. If that were the case, wouldn't poetry always be about ethics? Determining what's worthy of reverence or poetic observation is an ethical judgment, I said. A poetic life is a beautiful life, and beauty is ultimately about freedom, right? Throughout the 20th century, Canadian poets were writing pastoral poems that celebrated country life and the glory of nature. The ability to aestheticize the pasture is presupposed by dispossession, by colonization. One could argue then that indigenous life fell out of these poets' frames of ethical consideration. In fact, indigenous suffering had to continue unabated in order for their work to cohere. That's a vision of poetry that is unbeautiful, in my opinion. Maybe poetry that requires dispossession isn't poetry after all, but propaganda. I want to insist on a notion of poetry and of art making more broadly that is against violence and for shared flourishing. I think that implicates the human spirit, our ethical positions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Billy-Ray, for that incredible reading. And now, Bhanu, if you can read us an excerpt.
Thank you, Eunsong. Monster Checklist 2. Stop eating sugar. Sugar is destroying your arteries in the context of chronic stress. Stop drinking water. You don't need to drink so much water. It's hard to find a toilet at every turn. Don't spend your entire life flinching from a blow that never comes when you expect it. If traditional food was cooked in your home, then learn how to make it from scratch. Laugh yourself sick in the company of your friends. Remember this: quince buds on a winter morning, the color of silver and shaved chalk. Perhaps you can draw a circle on a piece of paper, then fill it with light pink and green shapes, for example. This is how your brain starts to heal, releasing dopamine in response to contrast. Stop telling the story of your betrayal by a particular community. Who would you be if you stopped telling that story? It's important to reframe every day if necessary. The idea that you're the monster of an organization or a family, that is, unless you're the actual monster. It's so unlikely that that is the case. If you're reading this book, then it's 98.5% more likely that you've been pathologized by others for suggesting that appropriation is an act of colonial violence. Read the colonial history that sourced your displacement and your family's displacement in order to distinguish the violence of your childhood from the violence of the world, or conversely, to understand how the two were linked. Many things help me to continue in my life, including adequate therapy, but those things might not be the same for you or available to you, the one reading this checklist. Glean bitter, nourishing herbs. We went over that already. Your friends, for example, are the jewels of your life. Above all, cyborg, don't forget that.
Thank you so much, Bhanu. So I have a question about kind of both of the excerpts both of you read. Billy-Ray, in poetry class, you give us your thoughts on the ethics of poetry, or the story gives us thoughts on the ethics of poetry and the colonial history of Canadian poetics, and how, and this is from the story, quote, maybe poetry that requires dispossession isn't poetry after all, but propaganda. I want to insist on a notion of poetry and of art making more broadly that is against violence and for shared flourishing, end quote. And Bhanu, you write, from which you just read, quote, read the colonial history that sourced your displacement and your family's displacement in order to distinguish the violence of your childhood from the violence of the world, or conversely, to understand how the two were linked. End quote. And I was hoping that the both of you could discuss this, the ways in which your writing and critical reading can distinguish propaganda from shared flourishing, the violence of childhood from the violence of the world.
I suppose I can begin by saying part of my interest in writing about a poetry class, if even a fictional one, was linked to my own experiences as a teacher of poetry, noticing how my students, some of them at least, were struggling to distinguish beauty from violence. They were observing, intelligently how so much of the beauty of the world is bound up in so much of the violence of the world. And wanting poetry, as I have as well in various points in my life, wanting poetry to be able to contribute to a larger project of collectivity that insists on life rather than destroys it. And in order, I think, to get there from my context, which is the country of Canada, I felt that I had to go through the history of the pastoral poem, because as the prof mentions in the story, that whole tradition is only possible through Indigenous dispossession. And so that means that we have to write poems against the pastoral, against that tradition, and think really seriously about what it might mean to write poems in the wake of that tradition, but also that still maintain some form of reverence for the natural world. And that's a difficult task, I think. But I, in my own life, have been inspired by my students' willingness to take on that task.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Billy-Ray, it's so interesting to hear your thinking in the present with this community of students. And listening to you, I realize I'm just quite recently outside of that time of teaching in an MFA, but I really thought would be my whole life. And it's strange not to be in that in the US in the way that I was. So I taught intensively in an institution that was founded by, you could say, practitioners of a white experimental lineage, the beat lineage, the language poetry lineage. And it took me a long time. It took being on the inside of the outside of that inside to index my anxiety in some of those communal spaces to which I myself contributed, to like an activity of form, which is to say, I'm thinking of an anthology called Moving Borders, that often kind of move through the library, I suppose, or the classroom. There was an essay by Rosemary Waldrop. I don't know why I'm remembering it in this instance. She said something like, whatever you write, you're going to be writing about your mother, or you're going to be writing about your father. It struck me long ago. I only met her the once. It was snowing. I stole some donuts from a frat reception and slipped them into my pockets on a side note. Anyway, I don't think I would now teach through the image in the way that I trained myself to teach it, which is as a crystallized or dormant repetition, the very thing that we elaborate to garner praise, affection, love. What am I saying here on this Zoom? But instead, for me, that boundary between the violent repetition of the image, which is to say, a kind of content that is never disturbed. I would train myself and I would train others to think of the image environment, which is perhaps the realm of the pastoral or the domain of what lies beyond what can be thought inside the image. I would think of that boundary around the image as the site of discernment between the two kinds of violences. That's the closest I can come to it right now. And as an activity of form, you know, as a writer and in a context of reverse migration to a birthplace, which is to say to a place where I was never actually considered a subject or somebody who was born in the first place. I would say, like, I'd like to keep thinking about what orbits the image and what lies beyond the image that is made through language. And for me, that enters the realms of epidemiology and also performance. And that's what I'm curious about at the moment, as the place to keep thinking about the two kinds of historical violence that I think you're asking about, Incong. Thank you.
Thank you, Bhanu, and thank you, Billy-Ray. To continue this kind of train of thought just for a little bit longer, in Billy-Ray, in the story Lived Experience, the reader is taken through a critique of history, like history with a capital H kind of history, and the university space of learning. And the story describes a professor who, quote, in not wanting to get it wrong, decides to fundamentally exclude the presence of colonialism and Indigenous studies. And this reminded me of in Bhanu in section 19, Soft Craziness. The speaker states, quote, "I was a monster, but the surgeon said no." So I was sort of thinking about like this authority figure, this professor surgeon who denies. And I was hoping that the both of you could discuss the process of unmaking institutionalized forms of violences and the kinds of authorities that they take up.
Yeah, something that you've said, Bonnie, was really resonating with me about how we attend to the violent repetition of images. And I think tied to this is also the ways in which certain images are denied repetition or existence in the first place. I think in Lived Experience, I was interested in depicting the life of a young Indigenous university student who is desirous of certain forms of knowledge because there's an instinctual sense in him that those forms of knowledge exist, but he doesn't know how to attain them or be in their presence. And thinks the university might give him access to that knowledge, but it doesn't. And how he finds it really is in the, you know, the interplay of affect that is, you know, two Indigenous bodies coming together in a scene of affection and intimacy. So maybe I was interested in showing or contending with the ways that the body becomes the place where you're both sort of dealt the blow of withheld knowledge, but also it is also the place that preserves that which cannot be totally, you know, obliterated. So I guess really, yeah, you're right in it, you know, identifying that scene is really about, as you say, the unmaking both the making of institutionalized violence and its unmaking. And I, as as someone who was once a young Indigenous university student, and has the luck and the honor of teaching young Indigenous university students, like there's a real like felt embodied kind of rebellion that the institution can't do away with or incorporate into its own knowledge project, that I think is important to foster.
Yeah, I mean, like, I do think it's like the authority of the professor who's wearing this like too big blazer. It's like both predicated on the fact that, well, he has assessed that he doesn't know enough to say anything, which is like the site of like why the exclusion is justified. And like I mean, if it's like this kind of circular logic that like if you think about it for more than like 15 seconds, like your mind kind of explodes. But also if I like, both like Tom and Will, like their bodies are like, I think Will like leans his head over in that moment. And so like they're not alone in knowing that like, okay, is it then their labor to like teach this professor who is not going to be grateful to learn about all that he does not know. They'll just be penalized. But they're not alone. They're not alone in this kind of this critique, but also this embodiment that the function of authority and exclusion are like tied together. And Bhanu, like, like the speaker, the cyborg saying like, I was a monster, but the surgeon said no. Like there's something about kind of like the professor and the surgeon that I was sort of like thinking about together as I was rereading both of your books.
Thank you, Billy-Ray and Incong. Incong, when you asked your question, something that was lived out for me in your response, Billy-Ray, I immediately, like X-ray, immediately saw what I understand to be the inside of the body, whose body, but it felt like the right side and around the liver, the gallbladder, I suppose also the ascending colon. I'm not like completely sure what is there in the upper right quadrant of the actual body. And I suppose when we say the body, it's often like the flesh, below the diaphragm. I don't know that I think of my heart when I think of my body. That's probably wrong. I don't know that I think of my nervous system, but immediately to translate in this moment, that glimpse, that X-ray, that preparatory surgical protocol of identifying where the scalpel will go in, what the problem is. In advance, it's showing me that the institution is both a surface and an enclosure. I'm thinking of Lauren Berlant's phrase as spectatorial composure. It's a place where witnesses are present in the form, I suppose, of nurses. There's also going to be detritus. It's going to be messy. So who is cleaning that up? And of course, there's the person on the table. So what I'm describing is like the chronicity of flinching in an institutional space that may or may not be a university department or a department of English literature or creative writing. And then as you were talking, it sort of like resembles like a piece of bunched up aluminium foil. So what is that anti-colonial protocol, or what is the protective protocol in that instance? You've just been born. You might be sedated. Things may or may not be going well. Perhaps this is the first minute of your life. Perhaps it is the end of your life. What is it to rise up from that table and leave dragging or trailing tubes of various kinds? You know, when you see documentaries and a calf is born and they stand up and wobble and sort of like gallop off. As I smooth out like that crumpled fascia, that also has been serrated in some way, I'm thinking of a page that might reflect this occasion, but also refract it. So I'm thinking of the noise of that crumple and what it would be to uncrumple, I suppose, and to inflate, which is the breath. But also as I kind of listen to this conversation or trying to be a part of it, I think of the institution as a zone of appropriation. So for me, the one other response would be, as you once said in song, possibly in Montana, the politics of refusal. So I'm in a place right now where I'm writing works that I complete, but are in some way unpublishable, or the work itself I'm thinking of as a score and not the end point. And so maybe I'll pause there in a place that kind of is maybe out, not in the classroom, but is deep inside the body.
Thank you. Thank you, both of you, for your thoughts on that. So the panel is titled Surviving Coexistence, which I thought was like a very fascinating title that we could perhaps talk about and think about together. And I wanted to ask in particular about your relationship, both of your relationships to the term survival. Billy-Ray, your collection is titled Coexistence, and in the story One Woman's Memories, the language wonders, quote, "What is luck in the face of genocide," unquote. And Bhanu, Incubation has the title A Space for Monsters, which might function as a haven for elements that are usually invoked to be destroyed. So I was hoping that the both of you could discuss your relationship to standardized definitions of survival, and then perhaps what you make of this panel title, What is Surviving Coexistence? What do you make of surviving coexistence?
Thanks, Eunsong. Billy-Ray, I might just begin because I just quickly scrolled down something you said earlier. I think you said, the place that preserves that which can't totally be obliterated, something like that, that which can't be totally obliterated. So I'm really curious about preservation, obliteration, which reads to me like, from the standardized definition of survival, I suppose, an object or a practice that persists across time, but always with the sense, like when we speak about survival, that it's to survive something that was quite difficult. And so maybe I'd just like to say that in advance of the panel, yes, to think what is survival, but also really curious about that phrase. And I hope that I remembered it correctly, Billy-Ray, as you were speaking.
Yeah, that was correct. And I suppose the image I had in mind was that of two bodies intertwined. Like there's a scene in that story where the two young men, Will and Tom, are in a small bathtub together, and it's after midnight. And the narrator in that instance, says that something to the effect of his world feels small, but it's a necessary and beautiful kind of smallness, and that he's, at peace with the scale of his living, or he's okay with it. And I guess I was thinking about the ways, like different scales of living. So there's the historical scene that we're always living out as, in my case, an Indigenous person, but we are all a part of that tableau. And then there's this scale of the intimate, though I don't want to put them at odds, but rather obviously think of them in a more like dynamic sense spatially. The scale of the intimate, which can make preservation feel possible. And I'm just looking, at one standard definition of survival, which says the state or fact of continuing to live or exist, typically in spite of an accident, ordeal, or difficult circumstances. And the point about luck, that in the story One Woman's Memories, when that comes up, the woman is talking about her time in a residential school, and she says, how some years she was able to see her family more than others, and those felt like lucky years. And then the sort of, I guess, interior thought is, what is luck in the face of genocide? Yeah, maybe I'll pause there and see what else comes up.
I once visited North Carolina, a spooky university called Wake Forest. There I was at the plush after dinner in a barn. I was just there for a day and a night, part of being a poet, I guess. You're invited. There's a meal to follow, and you sit next to other invited guests. I remember sitting next to a researcher. I'll have to find their name in my blog. That is closed. Sorry, Eunsong, that is another anti-colonial strategy that I was thinking. I'm right now in Churchill College, and there are lots of people in Cambridge working on AI and so on. So I was thinking that the next level of not writing or never writing or not publishing is also that other people can't be trained through exposure to this other kind of writing, for example, on a blog. And I thought maybe like it is more protective to write books than it used to be. At the same time, in the same way that I was speaking about like what bounds an image, perhaps I think that way about books. And I'm curious about like setting them on the grass or in the snow, and thinking of those books as artifacts as well that may or may not be preserved. But the researcher that I spoke to was from Sri Lanka, and their research related to like post-tsunami. So that in the 10 years following the tsunami, like something that their research group had tracked was or one of the things that they're looking at, like how do people survive, or, what after a disaster, like what is survivance in that context? And one of the things they look at is the kind of how how are the children doing, their health, the return to school, and so on. So in the 10 years after the tsunami in Sri Lanka, in this particular region that the researcher was looking at, the children thrived, like excellent grades, got into the next tier of their secondary schooling or university. But after 10 years, health rates dropped off abruptly. And they took vials of the saliva at different stages. And I believe it was interleukin-6, so inflammatory process, peaked 10 years later. And when I heard that, I thought of like the neighborhoods that I grew up in West London, which in the 70s and 80s, for me, were difficult places to be. It was the rise of the far right. We lived next door to a member of the National Front Youth League, who would like empty everybody's milk bottles in the morning and refill them with his own urine. And I mean, every day, this kind of environment. My dad coming home in a duffel coat after a chair had been smashed on his head at school. You can't touch us, Mr. Kapil. So a terrible kind of era that is sort of echoed in the present here in the UK and, of course, in the elsewheres. But I think when I heard that piece of research, that I understood. And I think that's what I've been trying to write about, that instance of collapse that is very much to do with the tissues of the body. And maybe what we think of as survival in the context that I'm trying to recall or describe or analyze is very much related to that flinching and the cost of surviving in that particular way. For my community, it's a bit too late to think of healing prospects. So to kind of look ahead, perhaps for me, that the intimacy that you speak of, Billy-Ray, I'm trying to generate in a place that I earlier described, not as my body, but I don't know what it is, the heart. But when I write, more and more, I address and imagine not a person from my own lineage, but a non-genetic, or I want to say agenetic descendant, someone who doesn't have my eyes. I'll pause there.
Thank you. Yeah,
and sorry, and curious as well, Billy-Ray, I feel as if I read somewhere like, as I began to orient to this conversation, I think I found something in which you also write about epidemiology and community and the body load. And I was really curious to hear about that part of your research as well, and how that research not interacts with, but is an influence on these fictions, on this thing that might resemble prose, but is also poetry.
Yeah, that's a great point of convergence, I think, between our work. And when you mentioned the gallbladder, something also came into view for me, because this was at the end of my first degree, I had my gallbladder removed. And there are several people in my family who had to have that surgery. And when I was going through that, I was trying to make sense of, how it happened. I was only 21. And well, this was compounded as well by my experiences of racism in the healthcare system when I was in distress and in a hospital, doctors not believing me, and thinking about these statistics. I saw that in the US, I think I saw one statistic that said 80 to 100% of Native Americans will experience some kind of, or will have gallstones, will develop gallstones. And of course, we could look at that purely, epidemiologically, or, biomedically as this, but we can also think, I think, additionally, of the ways that there's a certain sort of accumulation of history in the body, deposited in, the gallbladder, among other organs. But so it was in the wake of that experience that I also was thinking more broadly about indigeneity as a zone of biological struggle, and of the reserve as well, as an extension of the body, as a kind of another layer of flesh, or another, kind of skin. And in that essay, I'm trying to think about, though I don't know if I necessarily say this or articulate this clearly, I'm thinking about the ways that our sort of normative discourses of political repair don't actually allow for us to think about the ways that that historical toll is already so embedded in our bodies. And so that, when you're saying, Bhanu, about sort of it feeling sort of too late for you, or for a certain generation, yeah, I feel like in Canada, we've had this national cultural reconciliation throughout the current century. And, from the outset, I felt that it was too late, both for, of course, the people, our, my ancestors and others who both, some survived, some did not survive the atrocities of the 20th century, but even too late for someone like me who, inherited, that trauma inside my body, where, yeah, the question of survival is just one of like how you make do with that debt, and maybe also how you think about how to stop its, transmission.
Thank you so much, Bhanu and Billy-Ray, for your thoughts, and that exchange is incredible. Our time is coming to an end, but I want to make sure that there's at least like a minute, just in case, like, Bhanu, you have thoughts, or Billy-Ray, you have like last thoughts that you want to leave with the Brooklyn Book Festival.
Yes. Billy-Ray, I'm really moved to have this evening to morning portal to meet you in life like this. And what I want to remember from this experience is, yeah, what's that? What is it to write when it's already too late? So thank you so much, and thank you so much, Eunsong, for your thoughtful questions that led us into this conversation about survival. Thank you.
Yeah, I have a similar note of gratitude. I've been thinking with your work for what feels like a long time already, Bhanu, and it's been important to my poetics, and really honored to have had this space. And yes, thank you as well, Eunsong, for your really thoughtful questions.
I have so many more questions, but I will say thank you both so much. Thank you for existing. Thank you for writing the books that you write. I hope we can all meet together one day in person in a future unlike this present. And once again, Billy-Ray's book and also Bhanu's book can be purchased with the link below. Thank you both so much.